So first off, I'm just going to get rocking and rolling. And please welcome Daniel Lindberg. He's going to give us the overview of Grin for the layperson, product manager extraordinaire for Grin. Please give it up.
Right. So layperson's intro and value proposition. And so I was kind of thinking about value proposition, and there's kind of three quotes that come into my mind often when I work with Grin. First one is one from Dieter Rams. Good design is as little design as possible. The second one is one from Aldous Huxley about organization. You don't want too much of it, and you don't want too little of it either. And the third one, has any of you guys seen, what's it called, The Green Book, the movie? Anyways, there's like a quote in that film, actually my granddad said it first, don't flash your cash when you're buying a beer in a bar. And that's something that I often think about when it comes to Grin and its relation to privacy. So today, I'm going to be covering a lot of stuff, very high level, not very technical at all. Just to kind of give you like a glance. A lot of other people are going to be speaking more in depth about these things. Talk a little bit about the protocol, the project, some of the technical details of the implementation, mentioning proof of work, current status, give examples of some community projects out there, how you can contribute. And then I kind of come back to the value proposition. Sounds good? Yeah? Okay, let's start. So Mimblewimble protocol was proposed by an anonymous person in 2016. It was improved by Andrew Polstra the same year. It's a new type of blockchain design that relies on the work of Gregory Maxwell with confidential transactions, which uses mathematics, cryptography to blind amounts and still allows you to do some kind of cool math stuff with it. And CoinJoin, which allows you to aggregate transactions with each other. And also one-way aggregate signatures, which basically allows you to do this non-interactively, i.e. the participants don't have to be involved, but you can do this externally. There's no amounts, there's no scripts, there's no addresses, there's no kind of non-confidentiality. There's no way to kind of opt out of privacy, by default. And it's a very simple protocol that leaves little room for wallets or end users to accidentally leak information. Ownership is proved by a single-use key, and that's kind of also the key contribution and insight in the Mimblewimble paper. So usually, when we talk about this to new people, what the kind of first question is, what? Like, no addresses, what do you mean? How do you send transactions back and forth to each other? And the protocol requires interactive transaction building, where if I'm going to send one Grin to Ignatius, I create a slate and I pass it along to Ignatius, who in whichever way I want, whether I have him on Keybase or Telegram, or I can email him, or whichever way I want to send this transaction slate to him. He does something with that. He receives it and processes it and returns it back to me. And I can then finalize the slate and broadcast it to the network. So it requires a round trip between the sender and the receiver. And the neat thing about this is that it's also possible in reverse, which kind of creates like an invoice flow, where I can say, hey, Ignatius, you owe me 5 Grin, pay me now. I send you the information. He processes it and returns it to me. And I, as the receiver, can finalize and broadcast to the chain. This is also very good for enterprises, because then they can actually broadcast the transactions and not have the users do it and leak information as they do that. So a little bit on how kind of the transaction work with Mimblewimble. Credit goes to Andrew Polstra, I think, who was the first one to kind of pioneer this way to describe it. Is that you have a set of inputs, you have a set of outputs. The inputs are essentially just old previous outputs, and you reference new outputs. And then you have transaction kernels, which is like cryptographic fairy dust to prove that a transaction occurred, and to prove that you have ownership of that transaction, and also prevent secret coin generation, you could say. So these can, if you have transaction 1 and 2, you can basically join them together and into a single transaction. And if you see here, in transaction 1, there's an output, the blue box, that is later being used as an input. if you have this, these essentially cancel each other out. And that's cut through, basically, in the Mimblewimble protocol. And similarly, on the blockchain level, if you have the block headers here, you still have a bunch of inputs here, a bunch of outputs, and transaction kernels. You can join them together into one single big transaction on the blockchain. And again, any outputs that are then being used as inputs can be removed. The initial sync then, what somebody needs to do is to download the block headers, download the unspent transaction outputs, and the kernel set, and that's it. That's like a full sync, and it has pretty much similar security guarantees as a full node in other projects. So some of the pros and cons with Mimblewimble: there's no amounts, there's no addresses, it allows for better scaling. One con is that it requires interactive transaction building, but I would say it's also a pro in the sense that because of this, you have to participate in order to receive money. So you can't just spam people or send money to addresses without them actually actively accepting the money. Some output linking is still possible. Just as we saw here, we could kind of identify the blue box both as an output and then as an input. So it's not perfect that way, and you could kind of build up some kind of transaction graph as a result. There are some attacks that are possible. Ian Myers did a great talk on, I think, DevCon 4 for Ethereum, which you can have a look at, where he outlines some of those. There's no scripting possible, but scriptless scripts. I think Andrew is going to be talking about that later today. And some information on the project itself. Some of this has already been repeated, so I'm going to kind of go fast over it. Igno created this just shortly after the Mimblewimble paper was announced. It's written in Rust. It's fully open source, community driven, funded by donations from the community. And there's no ICO, there's no CEO, there's no devco, there's no advisors, there's no investors, there's no founders rewards, there's no pre-mines, there's no pre-allocation, pre-anything. The aim has been to create a fair project. Why bother? You might ask. And back then it was like 2.5 years ago. I guess Igno kind of what he felt was that Mimblewimble as a technology was very much something that was worth experimenting with, and it wasn't maybe possible to do it as well with Bitcoin or as a sidechain, because 2.5 years ago sidechains were still kind of theoretical, mythical beasts, I think, and they still are to some extent. It just allows the project to move faster and go in directions that maybe wasn't fitting with Bitcoin. And in a way, I think that's to the benefit of Bitcoin, not to the detriment, because we're guinea pigs. We can kind of push the new technologies, experiment with new things, and whether it works or not, and whether it proves to be good, that's either way learnings that can be incorporated into Bitcoin and other projects as well. I often describe the project as completely open for anybody to participate in. Fair in the sense that both in the launch and in how its submission rate is constructed. I'll talk a bit more about that. It's honest because we can be honest, because we have no incentives not to be honest, and it doesn't make any difference for us. It's minimal. We're trying to do absolutely keep the protocol level as small as possible, which is quite tricky. It's rational in that we try to kind of rely on scientific principles in the way we work, and it's transparent. We try to keep everything out in the open. When it comes to the governance model, I guess one way to summarize our thoughts around it at this point is that governance is really hard. It's definitely a human problem. It's a political problem in a way, and you can't just throw a technological solution onto that problem, I think, and it's very hard. It comes at trade-offs, whichever way you go about it, and our approach is basically to try to do as least harm as possible in the way we structure it, to keep it as simple as possible, and to constantly evolve it. One of the first contributions I made to the project was to kind of do a comparison and evaluate whether a foundation would be good to have. And the conclusion we arrived at that point was that it probably didn't make a lot of sense for us, and we was just kind of creating a centralized structure, and it wasn't really clear for what reason. We still encourage anybody to create a foundation if they want, or 3 foundations, but it's just not something that, there's no the foundation or anything like that with the project because it's just not needed. There is a technocratic council that we're kind of constantly second-guessing ourselves about the role it should have and the functionality of it. We're trying to take all the decisions now in open bi-weekly meetings, one for development and one for governance, every Tuesday in our Gitter channel, and anybody can kind of join and participate into that, and that's where all the decisions are being made. So it's working right now. We don't know for how long and so on, but we'll be ready to evolve as we need. On the implementation side, some of the technologies that we rely on, Schnorr signatures gives us multisig and scriptless scripts. Bulletproofs, so when you do confidential transactions, one kind of problem is that you need to ensure that there are no negative amounts, so you need a range proof, and there we use bulletproofs that some of the people presenting later today have been part of creating. Scriptless scripts, again, Andrew is going to be talking about that, enables some kind of scripting language with some clever mathematics and atomic swaps. And Dandelion, which we had heard Quentin is the Dandelion guy. It's basically a way to make it harder for people in the network who are monitoring the network to see from where a transaction originated, from which IP. So it's a way to basically obfuscate where transactions came from. Some future areas of research maybe that we're kind of interested in is Fly Client, enables a very light client. The Lightning Network is possible, confidential assets is possible. I think Benedict is speaking about accumulators later today. And there's also BLS signatures. We don't really know. We kind of want to be exploring these further as we go along. In terms of emission for Grin, it's 1 Grin per second forever. It's realized through proof of work, 1 minute block time, which gives 60 Grins per block as a reward. It's very simple. It's very easy to explain to someone, and it's fair. It discourages kind of an unfair advantage for early adopters. Again, there's nothing for us to kind of gain from that, and we'd rather have a situation where anybody can join, and they can join a bit later, and they don't have to be there first in order to kind of reap advantage for the others, because it kind of disincentivizes, I think, other people to get involved. So instead, it's something that has quite a big emission early on, and then over time it kind of decreases. In terms of proof of work, John is going to go into much greater detail than I ever can do. But I'll just say that you start with a mess of different hash tables, lots of nodes, and in the billions. And what you want to be doing is to clear those up to end up with something that looks like a cycle or a loop. And that's the kind of the very high-level summary of the proof of work. We have 2 of them, 2 variants, one for GPUs and one for ASIC development. We're kind of ASIC targeted and encourage ASIC development on it. Over time, gradually from launch to year 2, we're looking to migrate away from the GPU proof of work down to a fully 100% ASIC targeted proof of work. So the reason why we're doing this is basically to bootstrap the network. It's quite hard to do this in a fair way in 2019. We wouldn't want to give ASIC manufacturers an unfair advantage early on to have a secret ASIC and kind of take control of the hash power of the network. So it starts at 10% only, and then linearly over time it increases. So current status, launched 10 or so days ago, fairly smooth. There's, yeah. It's quite exciting. It's just business as usual after that. We have a lot of work to do. In the box right now, you get a node with a mining protocol stratum. You get a wallet, does basic commands. You can do this interactive transaction building via file exchange. You can use Keybase, the Keybase API, so you can kind of send to a Keybase profile if you want, and HTTPS. There's also a miner. It's quite nice. It's got plugins both for NVIDIA and AMD GPUs for both of these algorithms, and they're all kind of free and available to use. And in terms of what's next, a lot of time being spent on quality of life, security, performance, improving the documentation, and nurturing the ecosystem. The design decisions of being minimal kind of means that we expect a lot of the end user facing solutions to come from other people than the kind of the core project. Project is very minimal and does the least amount of work possible on that level, and then we expect ecosystem to basically build out functional wallets and other stuff essentially that end users end up using. People often ask also about exchanges and how we do integrations there. Generally, we don't do applications. We don't do NDAs. They've been asking sometimes for us to sign NDAs, but there's no legal entity, so I don't know what purpose it would serve if I signed an NDA, for example. We don't pay any listing fees. We're broke. We do try to be helpful with exchanges. We encourage integrations. We also encourage contributions to the dev fund from the exchanges that they do. We're seeing a lot of exchanges kind of showing interest, and every once in a while they announce support, which is kind of fun. And it seems to be working okay, even without our kind of heavy involvement in it. Some selected community projects. David, as you heard from before, he's doing Grin++. Check it out. There's a community mining pool in addition to GrinMint from BlockCypher. There's 2 explorers, GrinScan and Grin Explorer. TM Gox is our little swag shop. It's done by a community member. He or they have the swag and all this. The profits from these go directly to the dev fund, which is very nice. There's a GrinHub community and a kind of resource page on Telegram. I do a weekly newsletter. If you want to sign up, you can scan the QR code or just check out Grin News, where we kind of summarize the developments of each week, what's happening in the news. Right. And if you want to contribute, as Hashmap said it best, just do it, just get involved. We really need all kinds of people, developers, researchers, front-end engineers, UI UX specialists, graphic designers, technical writers, and just community members in general to help us test and improve our governance. You don't have to ask for permission to get involved. Just, it's open source. Just get started somewhere. First step could be to help out in the wiki side of things and improve documentations. There's a Telegram group that has this rule of being excessively polite and nice, and I think it's a very good rule, and we try to apply it in general in the project. And if you don't want to get directly involved, as we've said before, you can look to fund Yeastplume. Many people have already raised it, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but yeah, that would help a lot. It's a good way to protect your investment as well. If you're looking to mine a lot of Grin, you're going to have your Grins, right? You're going to mine them, but you also will probably want the value of Grin to appreciate and the protocol to be stable and secure to protect your investment. So the best way to do that is to help fund the developers on the core protocol. And if you want to get a kind of technical crash course, there's some really nice talks from our last Grin conference in Berlin. They're available on grincon.org. Check them out. And then coming back to that value proposition, then we have those three quotes. So Grin's not perfectly private yet. It does the job quite well, but it's not perfect yet. It's minimal in design, and that's the kind of the tricky part of it. The hard part is to make something that's minimal, not to try to throw in everything but the kitchen sink in it. We don't like centrality or hierarchies. We try to avoid it. We realize that we can't really completely avoid it and be completely anarchic, but we see problems with having central structures and hierarchies and too much organization in a way, because it doesn't really enable an ecosystem to grow long term. I think people's expectations change when you do that. Key thing is that privacy is turned on by default, and you can't really kind of turn it off on the protocol level. Only the active participants in a transaction can prove that they have been involved in a transaction if they need to, but it's not possible to kind of opt out of this on the protocol level, and that's crucial. You can't really do privacy well if it's opt-in, because you're basically self-selecting. It shows that you have something to hide, potentially. So it's very problematic to have that, and it's really key strength to have privacy turned on the protocol level. And community-driven, I spoke a little bit about it. It's the strength as well, because we really want other people to kind of step up to the plate and get involved themselves. And if you're not community-driven, then it's very often so that people will expect, oh, there's going to be like a development company. They're going to be building all this stuff for us. And I, as a community member, I'm basically just a user, a consumer. And we don't really want that relationship. We want everybody who participates to be able to contribute and help grow the community. And the fact that we're doing a fair launch and we're having this mission schedule really kind of aligns our interests and protects our integrity. It's very easy for me to stand up here and say, you know, we're not perfectly private, because I have nothing to gain from saying something else. It keeps us all honest, and it kind of, I think, self-selects the people who want to get involved as well, because it's not like an immediate way to have a financial gain from this. It's more about the technology and building something cool, I think. So that's it. That's that. 20 minutes. Thank you. Are you doing questions?
Thank you, Daniel. And we've gone through 2 presentations, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I think that's it. Unless you had one question from the audience you wanted to take.
Sure, sure.
Is there one question for
Seems
Daniel?
like that, yeah.
Very quick. Will you be able to post this presentation, or will the presentation maybe be posted so that we don't have to take photos?
Oh yeah, of course. We're going to publish them on, there's a repo called Grin PM, which is like, we keep our meeting notes, and also we keep presentations published there as well.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone.